So we are going to be joined with a design panel. It's all part of the regular slot I do with Design South East. Normally we catch up with Chris, but as I say, we're going to catch up with some panel members today. I was hoping, firstly, all of you could introduce yourselves to us.
Hi, my name's Alan Attlee. I'm the chair of the Swale Regional Design Panel, which is a panel that meets frequently to look at design issues and projects that are coming forward in Swale. But I've got a day job. I'm the head of the Canterbury School of Architecture at the University for the Creative Arts, and I'm an architect and urban designer by training.
Hello, I'm Luke Engelbach. I'm a landscape architect and urbanist. I sit on the Swale panel, but I also sit on South Downs National Park panel as vice chair. Similar sort of review process goes on, and I also teach.
And I'm Jeff Noble. I'm a town planner and urban designer, and I work with Chris Lamb at Design South East. We manage the panel.
Well, I was hoping you could start off by introducing to our listeners a little bit more about the panel.
Sure. Well, design review is a process where design professionals and people with expertise in design, whether that's architecture, urban design, landscape and ecology, transport, for example, can come together and offer objective and impartial advice on projects that are being proposed in a local area, or often it's looked at a regional level for maybe larger scale projects or big infrastructure projects that might be of interest to a wider population. And it's really seen as a process where both the local authority, who are obviously dealing with the formal planning applications and the kind of the legal processes, can get some advice from other design professionals who, if you like, don't have a dog in the fight. So they don't own the site, they're not proposing the site, but they're looking at it with a kind of clear set of eyes, and they can use their experience to hopefully suggest perhaps ways in which design proposals can be improved so that the quality of them and the quality of the places that they impact on can be enhanced. So it's quite a well-established format, and in the South East there's been a long-standing panel in the South East which has looked at projects all across the region. But what we've done in Swale is that the local authority have identified a need for some kind of objective advice and expertise so that they can look systematically at projects that come forward on Sheppey and Faversham and Sittingbourne and deal with proposals for new housing or for new schools or for infrastructure, and at the earliest possible stage get some impartial advice that will help them to lead through the planning process.
So who would actually sit on one of these panels?
Well, the panel itself has a pool of members that we call on. So depending on the type of project that we're looking at, we might need different expertise. So if it's a larger scale urban project, then obviously urban designers, ecologists, landscape architects play a very prominent part. For single buildings, then the balance might change a little bit, and we would have perhaps more architects and perhaps some engineers who would be able to offer expertise in questions of sustainable design, as well as thinking about how the building will sit in the landscape and how its aesthetics might play a part in the quality of the design. And that pool of people that we have come from a really interesting, diverse set of backgrounds. So we have people who live and work locally, like myself, and Luke for that matter, but also people from large internationally recognised design firms and organisations who bring both a national and an international set of expertises to it. So for somewhere like Swale, it's a way of bringing in really high-level expertise to questions of placemaking and development locally. And I think giving the expertise that the local planning team have, giving it that kind of extra boost by bringing the panel in just for a half day or a day to review individual proposals and projects.
So I was hoping you could next tell me how a design panel can help with the quality of design and place and that kind of thing.
Well, what I try to do from my perspective as a landscape architect is to look at the big picture to begin with, and quite often things may come toward the panel where that hasn't been looked at, so we try to encourage that and give some pointers how you might do that. Now, in Kent, we have the Kent characterisation, so landscape characterisation study, which actually was a huge piece of work that was done a few years ago that actually starts to look at what makes up the landscape. But also, there's a way of looking at impacts of new development on the landscape as well. And those are things that I have particular particular experience in, so I can offer that as a suggestion and help people with that. Then when we come down to the next layer of thinking, we have to think about that wider environment. So we're thinking big, but actually acting at a local level. And that's very relevant for this particular week, because we've got all these negotiations going on about climate change happening in New York at the moment. And so I'm looking at how can we design places to reduce energy, deal with surface water runoff, how could we make them more ecologically friendly, how could we grow some more fruit and vegetables in our developments. All these things start to add up to give a certain character to a place, but they also are very useful. They're not just decorative, and this is called green infrastructure that delivers a series of green services. So it's something far more than just a decorating job. It really has to happen quite early on in the process. And the good thing about design review is that quite often designs come towards the panel at an early stage. That means that if they're not showing some of these ideas already, we have an opportunity to say, well, hey, you know what, there's a few things that you can do. Now, because I've been running my own Studio Engelbach for 16 years, that's our specialism. That's something that I can offer to the panel. Other panel members will be offering their particular specialisms from where they're sitting, and as a combination of 4 or 5 people at any one time, there's actually a rich mix of ideas that starts to filter down to any potential development, and hopefully that's going to raise the standards and make the development better, but also make the environment better as well.
So it's a way of helping you learn by past mistakes, and also bringing a wealth of experience to the design.
And yes, that absolutely, but also being aware of a wider range of issues. And I think that when you have a series of experts who have made it their passion to look into these things and to see things, it's much easier than just a single designer. And it's the same even when we work alone. It's always good to have comments from colleagues, so that you don't get too single-minded or blinkered in your vision. You say, because it's quite easy to miss something. And so when you have an open discussion done in hopefully a very friendly way, in a polite way, that can start to get better results. And I think that's the key thing.
So there's quite a big map actually of Swale behind us in the room we're in. We were talking a little bit about the sort of identities between Sheerness, Sittingbourne and Faversham, and they're very quite different in Swale. So I was hoping you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at the connections between places. I think sometimes when you're thinking about planning decisions and new housing or new schools, you inevitably look at the very immediate context and think, what's the impact on the neighbours next door and so on. And one thing that's important for any town or local authority or region is to really understand how the variety of types of places that they have add up to the identity and the kind of texture and culture of the whole region. I mean, at the very edge of that map is Whitstable, and I suppose that's a really clear example of a place which has somehow reimagined itself, and it's now attracted lots of inward investment. Lots of people want to live there. It's become an incredibly desirable place, but fundamentally it's an industrial fishing town historically, and now it's rethought itself through culture, through food production. And I think for the towns in Swale, there's a similar job to do, which is to really imagine what their future is, as well as looking into the heritage of the landscape and the heritage of the buildings and so on that are there, is to think about the future. What kinds of people do you want to attract to those areas? What are the sorts of amenities and services and places that they will want to support their lifestyles? So certainly somebody who comes, my accent probably betrays me that I don't come from Kent, but I moved here 10 years ago for work. And I remember first visiting Sheerness, for example, and thinking, it's an incredible landscape, it's got incredible kind of natural assets. It's also a bit weird, it's a little bit surreal in some ways, because there's been heavy industry there. There's this extraordinary landscape. There's the experience of visiting it. It's close to London, and yet it's this kind of strange other place. And I think capturing some of that is also an important job for whole communities to do, and design panels in a way can offer a kind of different perspective and can read places slightly differently as well, because they have that mix of local expertise and people from outside of the locale and the region. So beginning to think about what can Sheerness do to kind of capture that quirkiness as a destination, perhaps for day trippers and weekenders and new kinds of tourism, is an opportunity in Swale. I think the same goes for Sittingbourne. It's got a fantastic high street, although it could do with lots of kind of new energy brought to it, and that might be about thinking about people who live on the high street as well as just the kind of regular shops that would be there. And it's beginning to think about how changes to the infrastructure in Kent, high-speed rail and the ability to get around more easily, can change the types of people, the mix of people that might want to move and live in Sittingbourne. Faversham, again, has got an incredibly distinctive characteristic with the port, and has already got a very strong kind of built heritage. But there's also big questions there about how might the town expand and have more housing on the edge of the town. And then those questions become about, well, how do you redefine the edge of what is a historic town, and what kinds of questions does that throw up for the types of houses, the visual appearance, the way that people will live in them. So there's lots of big questions which are shared by communities all across the country, in fact all across the world. And the interesting thing about Swale is the diversity of places that are here. So there's a chance, I think, to develop a whole series of distinctive places which people could imagine as making Swale a very attractive place for visitors and for tourists and for new employment and new residents actually to move to. So places are never set in time. They're always dynamic and changing. And development and design is a big part of that. How do you manage that, and how do you make sure that you enhance the quality of individual places rather than just seeing development and change as a kind of threat to the nature of places and the way of life that people have?
I was going to say it's always difficult to hold back or to check or to hope that the heritage doesn't hold back the design, because there's lots of people who want to keep the heritage, but you can easily hold back new design and new ideas if you do that too much.
Absolutely, and I think if you look at what we think of as the great built heritage that we've got in Kent particularly, if you think about it as rising or springing from very particular moments, whether it's from agriculture and small farming, or whether it's from industry, whether it's from the naval heritage, these things where there were innovative new types of buildings, there were new features and objects in the landscape, but they came from some other processes, whether that's how landscape works, or whether that was how industrialisation was changing society. So what we now think of as the great heritage of the British landscape or the Kent landscape, in fact, came out of the kind of white heat of change and development and thinking about the future, and thinking also about making people's lives better. Ultimately, it's about making better places for people to have better lives, more employment opportunities, more cultural opportunities. So we shouldn't be frightened of the future, but I think we have to be clever about it, and we have to have the same intelligence and imagination that the Victorians had, or people had hundreds of years ago when they were first settling the land.
So not all new ideas are always good ideas, but as I was saying earlier, you've got to be careful you don't hold things back as well.
Well, one of the key things, I think, is to be able to look at what we have, our countryside or our cities, at the big scale and the medium scale and the small scale all at the same time. If you step out and look at the big scale, you think, well, we have a landscape which has certain qualities. Some of the growing elements in that landscape are older than some of our oldest buildings. So, of course, if they're going to be valuable for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, we've got some other issues that are happening on a global scale, like global warming, which is making the seas rise. Now, that's made a little bit more severe in North Kent, because after glaciation, Kent is actually sinking a little bit every year, a few millimetres. So the combination of sea level rises and Kent sinking a bit means that about 4 or 5 millimetres of sea level is happening every year. Well, over 10 or 20 years, that could be quite a lot. And that can threaten some of the coastal areas, some of the creeks. And we need to think about that, because that will affect how we do things in terms of development and for safety and for insurance and that sort of purpose. But in addition, if we start to think about the other effects of climate change, where it seems to be either raining a huge amount like it did earlier this year, just didn't stop, or not at all, like this summer, then that creates its own problems as well. So trying to maintain what you have becomes more of a challenge. That means that if you're going to do something, say, in a large housing area, you change the nature of the ground. If it's a housing area that's on a fairly open site, you're going to be paving over with roads and roofs a certain amount of it. It will affect how much water can go into the ground. That water is going to run off more quickly. It's going to cause a problem potentially somewhere else. But also you're changing the way that land takes in sun when it's hot. If it's a built environment, those bricks, concrete will heat up, and at night time they're going to push out heat. So what do we do for that? And there are ways of dealing with that with planting, with using the drainage system to give enough moisture to the plants during the hot periods so they can actually give us some cooling for free. And this is a way of starting to use less energy. So that, in fact, the way you design means that you can deal with water, you can deal with reducing energy, you can increase the amount of songbirds and all the things that we like, and butterflies and all that kind of stuff, which is actually shown to be good for your health. So suddenly you find that there's a whole range of things you don't normally think about in urban design that actually have a benefit for every single one of us, and that's why it's important for all of us to get interested and concerned about what happens in our neck of the woods. In the future, we're going to have to grow more food, because one of the problems at the moment is that in England we import about 50% of our food. Now that's coming from other places in the world who have their own problems. Either they're suffering from climate change, which is making it drier or hotter or wetter, or they've got more people in their populations who they need to feed themselves. At some point, we're going to be challenged. And in fact, a recent survey from the government showed that for 2030, we've probably got a shortfall of about 2 million hectares of farmland. Now, we can do something about that, even by growing things in our backyards or in our streets, but it needs a different mindset to allow these things to happen. If we design a development that doesn't have the flexibility to do new things over time, we could be making a rod for our own backs. So one of the things that we like to try and suggest to people is, look, is this design flexible enough over the next future few years or tens of years to change if it needs to change? Because that's a fundamental part of design. It's not a fixed thing. It's a changing world. Some things change quickly, some more slowly. But we have to build in this idea that there is some change. And I think that's a fundamental role for us on the design panel.
So it's not just looking at good design for now and what works now, but it's also looking to the future, but also looking at where you're putting that design, because it might work at the moment, but it's just not going to work long term.
That's right. I mean, a decision made now is going to affect your children or their children or your children's children. You know, it's a big deal because the world is changing so fast, and there are other things in there as well. We if you're young, you tend not to think about accessibility. But if you've got an elderly parent or grandparent, you suddenly realise that even a small step can be quite difficult for them to negotiate without help, or they can fall over easily and hurt themselves. So we need to start thinking about some of these issues too. So it becomes quite complicated, but it's easier if you can start to separate these things out into layers of thinking. And then you bring all those layers together, and that gives you a rich design, or a design with lots of possibilities. And ultimately, I think that's what we're looking for on any panel.
I think it's also, to follow on from what Luke's saying, it's also important to note that design review is not really about style. I mean, lots and lots of people probably think design generally is about how stuff looks and whether it's modern or traditional or vernacular or Georgian. I would say, experience of design review is that we very rarely talk about those things as kind of absolute factors, because design is much more about how stuff works, how it enables people to lead, happy, healthy, delightful lives. Design can get in the way. When things are badly designed, they get in the way. When roads are in the wrong place, they make people's lives a misery. When buildings overheat or leak, they make people's lives a misery. So design's much more about how it can enable people and communities to live a good life. And I think that's a popular misconception, that they think that here comes the style police and they want things to be modern or they want things to be traditional. But not increasingly, it's just fundamentally not what's important. What's important is understanding how stuff works, how it adapts, how it can cope with change, and how it can be part of the kind of building blocks of civic society, of how communities can live together, how more people having to live in smaller amounts of land, for example, which is a big issue in the United Kingdom, how that can be made to work. there's good examples from other countries of how it's been made to work, and we can learn from them. But we can also learn from the ground up about, good examples of the kind of vernacular way that people have adapted to their own communities and landscapes. So I think design review, shouldn't be seen as just experts coming in and imposing, their expert opinions, but much more a kind of interface as part of the discussion about planning and development, but it's a kind of interface between those big macro things. How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with population change? But also understanding the nature of places that exist and how that can be protected and enhanced, and how it can be taken forward in the modern world as well.
I agree. I think that if you understand that lots of small actions add up to a big action, that's the other scale of thinking when we look at design review, because we might be wanting something at the big scale to happen, but often those things happen because of a lot of small actions, and a lot of those actions are the way we behave ourselves or behave with one another. So ultimately we're trying to see if we can create places that are happier and healthier in the long run, and that doesn't mean how it looks or the colour of the wall or the shape of the house. It's something a little bit more fundamental than that, but it's really, really important. These are the building blocks, and it's often of how you do things, and it's often how you have started to look at other things and our own culture, how we react to things. So we might like to see we might like to refer to something we've seen in Holland or Germany, but that may not be right taken straight out of context for the United Kingdom in general, or Kent in particular. We have to understand how our local people are using things, and we also have to listen to what they're saying. And a lot of us get involved in public consultations, which is where we actually interface with people on design matters in their community, and we hear their views, and then we can start to take that on board in terms of our thinking. Local people know far more about their local place than the designer coming in from outside. So it's really, really important to listen as well as to give advice. And at the end of the day, it's that kind of mix that we hope to give when we're on a design panel.
Well, I know that's often the case. It's often good to bring someone in from the outside because they see an area in a whole new light, but there's also that experience of the people that have lived there for years, and probably the combination of the two can get something better out of it.
And they're going to be living there for some time to come. I mean, we had one person come in today who lived in his community and said, well, I'm doing something because I want it to be nice, because I intend to be living here, my family are going to be living here for a long time to come, so I don't want to be embarrassed by it. We thought, well, that's a wonderful thing to hear. It's not very often that you get that, but that is an example of how you can make something distinctive and local, because it comes with a certain amount of passion from someone who's been living in the place for a very long time, and they've got some investment in their community. And I think that is something that's quite important, and that's why the panel is quite interesting, that we've got people who are Kent-based, like Alan and me, and people who come in from further afield, who can also see things with slightly fresher eyes and a different perspective. And there's no right or wrong way in a way of looking at these things, because you actually need to have a discussion. This is a kind of a democratic way of trying to approach design, trying to lift things in general, trying to find all the good bits and amplify them, make them better.
I suppose it's also being aware of what works on paper doesn't always work in real life, and I've even seen these sort of design ethoses which seem amazing, but when they've been built, the people use it in a way you'd never have thought of, and it fails.
You can never plan for absolutely everything. So one of the key things is flexibility. Something that might be popular now might not be popular in 20 years' time. So that's something that's really important. 50 years ago, they'd never heard of skateboarders. And so people didn't worry about putting these little blips on the side of benches to stop people using that. But in 50 years' time, what is going to be the latest craze? We don't know. So we always have to have that ability to change and be flexible.
So sort of talking about that, is there a way of planning for the future, or leaving flexibility in design for things to adapt that perhaps wasn't done in other years?
Well, sometimes you need to grow something, and so you need to allow space for that to happen. If you're so tightly designed that you don't have any flexibility at all, that's always going to be a problem. And most designers can normally think their way out of a problem, because essentially design is about problem solving. But nevertheless, if you over-design and do things in the wrong way, then you can't go backwards. And sometimes on designs, there are certain bits of infrastructure that go in right at the beginning and they stay. We're still living with a lot of Victorian infrastructure now. So we've got to get that right. Now, in a world when not only is the climate changing, but we're using more resources than ever before, and there are a few of them around, we've actually got to start to think, how can we get the quality we want, but using less, so we do more with less? And that's really important too. So I think that's something that needs to come into the argument at the same time. It's not just about replicating all the old stuff, because we've moved on. We live in a different world. We have to do things differently. But it doesn't mean to say that they have to be worse. They can be better or even more exciting.
Yeah, I think it's also the case that if you look around the world at places that we probably admire, everybody probably admires Amsterdam, Barcelona, bits of Paris, bits of London. Most people admire coastal locations, and those kind of settlements that endure. They've often changed quite dramatically in terms of how they've been used. So the original plan thought of people inhabiting those places or their societies working in a certain kind of way, and they've changed radically, but there's something fundamental about the character and the quality of those places and why people enjoy them. So I think we can look at places around the Kent coast, for example, and see that the Victorians and the 21st century tourists behave very, very differently. But getting the fundamentals right, putting the buildings in the right place, appreciating the climate and how the climate kind of builds a comfortable place to sit and have a coffee or to sit and have a glass of wine, those things really endure, and people will come back time and time again to those qualities, the kind of the real qualities of life. We can kind of adjust our living and working patterns to some extent, but we'll enjoy good places and we'll always come back to them. So I think if you can get that sort of fundamental quality of life and an idea about the good life in place, then places will endure. And that's really about taking a long view of an individual town or location, rather than always just thinking about short-term consequences. What does it mean if this new house appears or that new house appears? But if you begin to kind of untangle the real distinctive nature of a place that people love and communities can often speak about more eloquently than any designer can, then that stuff will endure.
So just sometimes getting the design right, but also allowing it to grow, because sometimes some of the best places are where they've grown randomly. And myself, I quite like, I often think it's a shame where, there's sort of a series of old houses and they try and build one to replicate that. And I actually quite like this idea as it grows. So, that's a modern house there, and next to it is an old house. That contrast quite works, and it captures the time, and that place captures the history of life, really.
That's true, and that's the same in the wider landscape. In fact, we call it time depth. It's where you can see time in what's in front of you. And that's really important. The other thing is that a lot of people think that only the most special landscapes should be protected. But we're signatories to the European Landscape Convention, which says that every landscape is special. Everything's got something special to offer. And the special qualities of North Kent, for example, are huge open skies, very productive soils, wonderful wetlands, for example. They set it apart from other parts of Kent. And in fact, one of the amazing things about being from Kent is it's a large county with a huge variety of landscapes very close to each other. And that in itself is a wonderful thing. You can live in other parts of the world where it's the same for long distances. We're very, very fortunate in having that heritage and the way it's been looked after. And I think that part of what we have to do on the design panel is to make sure that we maintain the essence of that heritage as well, so that things don't go and mess things up. So there's a respect thing in there for what is collectively our own. Even if it might be owned physically by somebody else, we have this responsibility, this ownership. And I think that is something that's really, really important about saying where you're from and feeling that this is my place and it's not any place. And that's what we really don't want when we see a design review. We don't want any place. We don't want a little bit of this bit of suburbia sort of cut out and stuck over here, because that is not what Swale is all about. Swale has other qualities, other reasons why it's like it is. And I think we need to try and steer and guide people in the direction of how they can actually realise that to the best advantage on their given site.
I suppose it's looking at things at a stream again. It is getting that balance right, because it's like this building here. If you said it had to be protected and look exactly like this, you could get a scenario where no one new would buy it because they just can't do anything with it. But then on the other hand, if someone buys it and decides they're going to paint it pink, they'd ruin it. So it's getting that balance right.
That's right, but then again, they might buy it and knock it down and build something far better than ever was here, and it might still be a council office, but maybe it's a council office with houses attached as well, and maybe it's got roof gardens. I don't know. I mean, the thing is that you can do things in new and different ways, and they will be responsive to the time that they're in, as well as looking ahead. And ultimately, we're always looking for opportunities, how we fit in, and that's a key thing, because times are changing, we're getting more crowded, we've got to do things in a different way, and part of that is actually getting people to behave in a different way. So if for example, we want Sittingbourne High Street to be more lively, because it's a great place, then maybe we need to start to think about it in a different way. And then we can start to set the seed for something good in the future.
Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for covering those subjects, and I've no doubt we'll cover more subjects in the future of a regular slot with Design South East. But I'd like to thank the both of you for taking the time out and talking to me this afternoon.
Thank you, yeah.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, absolutely.